Good evening, I'm Lady Nopeingham. Tonight, I have 3 stories for you, all under the theme of badass female characters. The first is a story that shares a title with this video that was written exclusively for my channel by my favorite nightmare, Nightmare's Edge. The second is a fun little romp of a story called Pomegranate Lipstick by Reddit user Beelsback. And the third is a divinely ethereal story called Dream Girl by Dr. Plague. My heartfelt appreciation goes out to Nightmare's Edge for writing a story specially for my channel, and to Beelsback and Dr. Plague for allowing me to share theirs. I love all 3 of these stories, so let's get into them, and hopefully you will too. Don't Fuck with Tessa by Nightmare's Edge. Tessa had always been a shy girl. During high school, she was often made fun of because of her short stature. It was something that always bothered her, but she always tried to remind herself that she was the bigger person. Rarely did it have a lasting effect on her own outlook. Kids in school could be terrible, wretched things, and it often went unchecked by those who should be correcting this behavior, but rarely did. Tessa's shyness often led her to just accept the cruelty of those who were the usual perpetrators of these terrible acts against her, and she was not the type to tell on others. "It's not what the cool kids do," she later recalled her friends telling her. What Tessa didn't seem to realize, however, was that deep down there had been a darkness growing, one that would someday lead her down a path she could not return from. 2 weeks before graduation, a late prom was being held due to the virus that had taken the world by storm. Tessa had been asked by Stephen to the prom, and she had gladly accepted. Stephen wasn't popular or all that particularly good-looking, but he was funny and very, very smart, and one of the few people who were not constantly harassing her. She had spent the day with her mom, getting ready for the biggest night of her life. She had cut her hair short into one of those cute little styles that all the girls were raving about. She had spent a small fortune on a dress, and her mother did her makeup. To everyone except those who were cruel to her, she was absolutely stunning. When Stephen arrived at the door, he was utterly speechless at the sight of her. He knew that he was going to be the luckiest boy at the prom. He could hardly contain himself, and with great force of will, he forced himself to speak. "Hi, Tessa," his voice cracked. Tessa's mom was a short distance behind them at the door, and several tears escaped her eyes. Her daughter was going to prom, and she was absolutely beautiful. This Stephen boy seemed like a stand-up fellow, so she had no fear of her daughter going with him. She finally heard Stephen from the door. "Good evening, Miss Daughtry." "Hello, Stephen. No funny business. You know who I am." "Yes, ma'am," he replied, and he was certain he might have pissed himself if she had stepped forward. He extended his arm, and Tessa tucked hers around his as they left, her mom closing the door behind them. Stephen didn't have a car, so they planned to walk the few short blocks to the pavilion where the prom was being held. During their walk, some of those vile girls from the school drove by, yelling obscenities and hurtful words at them, but they didn't even seem to notice. Tessa and Stephen enjoyed their walk. He was captivated not only by how beautiful she was, but by her nerdy, geeky banter. Tessa, however, was actually looking at Stephen in another light tonight. He was deceptively muscular beneath those ill-fitting clothes. They finally arrived at the school and were about to enter, when those nasty girls stepped out the front doors and stood in front of them. "Who the hell do you think you are? You put on a dress and you think you're Rachel Lee Cook?" She laughed, an ugly laugh. "Just let us pass," Tessa said, her confidence surprising even herself. One of the girls stepped forward, and Stephen stepped between them. He wasn't intending to fight, but he wasn't going to allow them to hurt Tessa while he stood by. Without warning, one of the boys who was with the girls punched Stephen in the face. Tessa watched as it seemed to happen in slow motion. Then, a second boy started to kick Stephen as he leaned back slightly. Tessa stood frozen in fear. She had no idea what to do. Stephen was now on the ground, and the boys were continuing to beat on him, with no regard for how badly they were hurting him. "Tessa, run!" Stephen said between blows. Tessa was terror-stricken, but she listened to him. She would run home and get her mother, who was the chief of police in their small town. She heard the blows continue to rain down on Stephen, and then suddenly they stopped. She almost didn't hear it. "Dude, I think he's dead." There had been some excitement in that voice, but also alarm. She slowly turned around to see the last of the group close the door behind them as Stephen laid there, beaten and battered. Tessa dropped her small purse and corsage and started running back to where Stephen was laying, her shoes coming off as she ran. Tears were flowing down her face, her mascara running. Something inside of her started to speak, but she could not hear it, as in the moment she was only concerned for Stephen. She finally got to where he was laying and knelt down hard next to him, not realizing she had scraped her knees on the cement floor. She rolled him over onto his back and looked at his face, looking for some sign that he was still alive, but there was none. She put her ear next to his mouth and nose and listened for a breath, but none had come. Then she placed her fingers on his neck, wishing with every fiber that she would feel a pulse, but again there was none. Her tears stopped flowing. She felt nothing but pure, burning rage within her being. She stood up, not feeling the blood that ran down her legs from the wounds on her knees. She turned away from Stephen and walked back to where she had dropped her purse. She picked it up and slipped her hand inside. She found the handle immediately. The knife had been a gift to her from her father, who had died in the line of duty 5 years ago. He said that she should always keep it near her, as you never know when it might come in handy. What Tessa had planned now certainly was not what he had in mind. She turned back to the pavilion and slowly started stalking back. She was no longer the slight, timid girl. In fact, she would become the story that teachers would tell to their students in hopes to keep them from bullying each other. She heard the loud thumping music coming from the dance floor and headed in that direction. She pushed the door open and slipped inside. There, she looked for those who had just taken her Stephen from her. It did not take long, as they were in the middle of the dance floor, acting as if nothing had happened. And I suppose, to them, it was nothing. Stephen was nothing but some loser who probably would have thanked them for killing him because his life was so worthless. No one was paying her any attention, and somewhere deep in her mind, she knew this was a good thing, but in reality, she had already planned on doing what needed to be done, regardless. She walked onto the dance floor and towards the bitch who had stopped on the way in. Still, no one saw her. She walked up slowly behind the girl, and without hesitation shoved the small blade in the girl's neck, perforating the vital artery that lies there. She quickly pulled the blade out and stepped back into the crowd. At first, there was no reaction from anyone around. The low, flashing lights and the sound of the speakers booming with music covered the sounds of any scream that might have escaped the bitch's mouth. Tessa watched as the girl started to wobble, and another of her friends started to walk towards her to catch her if she fell. The boys were still dancing and had no clue what was happening. As the other girl reached her friend, Tessa was almost instantly by her side, again burying the small knife to the handle in her neck. The blood had now begun to pool underneath them, and one of the girls slipped in her struggle to flee. And since no one had realized yet what was taking place, Tessa bent over and sliced through her Achilles tendon. Both girls tried to scream, but Tessa pushed them forward and moved back into the crowd again. The boys, still dancing, finally turned around to see both girls on the floor and tried to rush to their sides, only to slip and fall in the pooled blood. One of the boys landed hard on his face, knocking himself out, while the other still attempted to crawl over to the girls. Tessa pounced again, landing hard on his back. Tessa noticed that someone outside of the group had finally realized what was going on, and she somehow managed to pull herself from the frenzy, making her way to the boy who had knocked himself out, the same boy who had thrown the first punch earlier. She didn't care that he was defenseless. She grabbed a handful of his hair, yanked his head back hard, and he awoke, only to feel a blade being dragged across his throat. With one more final thrust of the blade, she stabbed it into his neck. She left the knife this time, but the blood was already pooling. She looked out at the crowd, who now had begun to back away from the chaos, and she saw the teachers running in their direction. She was up and moving as fast as she could. She was short and small, yes, but she was quick. She bolted for the doors, knocked them open, and continued her sprint, although she had no idea where to go. After leaving the building, it was like a candle inside of her had been snuffed out, and that rage and anger she had felt was now slowly fading away. She gagged in disgust at what she had just done. "I have to get home," she thought, turning towards her house and sprinting into the night. She stood there at her door for a moment before knocking, as she had left her keys in her purse, which still laid where she had dropped it back at the pavilion. Chief Daughtry opened the door, only to find that no one was there. She stormed out onto the porch, shouting half-jokingly but with authority into the night, "Do you know who I am?" She looked around but didn't see or hear anyone. Sadly, she would later realize that the moment she had sent her beautiful daughter off to what should have been the most exciting night of her young life was the last time she would ever see her daughter again. There had been rumors that she had been the cause of the tragedy at the prom that year, but because of the chaos, the darkness, and the blaring noise of the music, no one could ever be certain. Pomegranate Lipstick by Reddit user Beelsback. We really shouldn't be doing this, she spoke between kisses. We're both ladies and... Hush, Emily, the other woman breathed, and Emily melted into the moment. They'd met less than an hour prior, when the party, a glamorous annual ball hosted by some rich family, was just beginning. Emily was tired of the spectacle the second she stepped out of her automobile. After 15 minutes of swirling golden champagne around in a crystal flute and avoiding conversation, her gaze was drawn to a woman across the floor. Her dress was emerald, a velvet number that hugged her like she was a film actress. Her hair fell in flaming auburn waves down her exposed back. Her lips were painted in a rich pomegranate lipstick. Striking hazel eyes met Emily's, and a heat arose in Emily. The woman smiled, a teasing invitation, and Emily was enchanted. Before they knew it, they were pressed flush together in a darkened hallway, away from the party and away from prying eyes. What is this? Emily whispered to the other, touching the smeared lipstick on her own lips. Does it matter? Was the response. She started, before both of their attention was snapped away by the sudden crack of shattered glasses and piercing shrieks from the ballroom. The moment ended, and both women started back towards the ballroom, where the screams continued. What Emily saw sickened her beyond measure. Dozens of guests were dead on the floor, pools of blood spattered across the marble floor, and the guests that weren't dead or hysterical were biting into other guests, latched on like ticks, or lapping up the spilt blood like dogs. Without thinking, Emily turned, grabbed her companion by the wrist, and bolted, both of their heels clicking against the floor as they ran. What was that? Emily sobbed once they were tucked away in a bedroom far from the chaos. What were those people doing? We need to run. She reached for the woman's hand, but the click of footfalls outside the door halted her. Quick, she whispered, into the wardrobe. They squeezed into the closet, and no later than a second after they closed the door, the bedroom door creaked open. Please, God, don't let this be the end. But, as if her own heartbeats were alarms, the wardrobe was abruptly opened, and it sent both women tumbling to the floor. The first thing she noticed about the man was his bloodied shirt, but the most striking feature were his shining white fangs. He stopped. Ah, I see, he said. This one is yours, Lucille. I'll leave you to it. What? Emily thought as the man left, turning to face her companion. She'd risen, and panic flooded Emily as her eyes locked onto a matching pair of gleaming fangs, stark white against the faded pomegranate of her lips. Sorry, Emily, I did love your company, but you can't leave alive. And death was bitter, but sweet too, like pomegranate. Dream Girl by Dr. Plague. She's walking through the halls of my high school. Her hair is a halo of gold. She runs through my dreams as I slumber, my sanity threatening to fold. I rubbed the bridge of my nose and took another sip of coffee. It was strong and black and warm from sitting untouched for so long. I looked back at what I had written, 12 verses written over a 5-year period, and each more troubling than the last. This poem would likely be my unfinished work, a labor of love that would remain my last big mystery. But the subject of the poem is herself a mystery to me. Lisa, the darling girl of my dreams, who every night steals a little more of my soul, has been with me for 5 long years. Lisa, the girl who no longer exists. I stroll through the halls of academia. I move through a silence that creeps. She glides like a goddess of reason, this angel who comes when I sleep. I wrote those words on January 25th, 2014. I was a sophomore in high school, still struggling to mold my burgeoning talent while dealing with the growing flames of my teenage horniness. I'd been told for years that I wrote well, English teachers and creative writing teachers praising my work, but they always said that my work lacked a focus that they hoped I would find in time. Your ideas are scattered, your thoughts uncoordinated, and for someone with your raw talent, these are threads that we hope you will find. This is what my 9th grade English teacher wrote on my final assignment, a short story about the idea of servitude, but not slavery, right under the lurid red A she'd written on the paper. Miss Harper had told me often that I had talent, but also told me that she expected me to focus that talent if I ever thought to make something of myself in the written trade. On that day, as I sat at the picnic tables outside the cafeteria and wrote ideas in my notebook, I found some of the threads she was talking about. I had slept deeply the night before and dreamed vividly, as I did sometimes. In the dream, I was walking through the halls of Chester C. Smith High School, and on that day I walked alone. There was none of the usual tropey, at school in your underpants sort of thing, but the school did have a slightly lucid feel to it. I felt like I was underwater, everything having a slightly wavy feel to it. As I walked, I began to become more and more sure that something was watching me. There was no one there. The silence in the school was almost oppressive. But at the edge of my vision, I could just make out the form of a girl following me. She slid silently along the walls, glided noiselessly through the world, and several times as I whipped around suddenly, I could just see her hiding from me. Those few glimpses were enough to tell me two things. She was human, and she was lovely. She stalks through my dreams like a shadow, a hunting cat ready to pounce. Her mind is a mystery to me, her very secrecy, her humanity renounced. I had the dream again a week later. It was much the same, walking through the silent halls of high school, the terrain wavering like aquarium weeds, as this ghostly girl stalked me. I did not indicate that I was aware of her, not turning or speaking, but just studying her out of the corner of my eye. She was blonde, corn silk hair spilling down her back in a sheet, and her clothes were a pair of jeans and a simple shirt of no particular design. She seemed to be my age, but could have been older. There was a way about her that made me think she was older than I in her mind, like when you meet someone who's had to grow up very quickly and been forced to cast their childhood aside before they were comfortable. She followed me silently until I woke up, and when I sat up, I grabbed for my notepad on the nightstand and wrote these 4 lines. I wouldn't visit her again for 3 months. Her secrecy seems to be prudent, for her shelter is not solely her own. I have seen that which lurks in the shadows, and it threatens to evict her from home. Writing about the Dream Girl was what I had named it after the second verse, had lit a fire in me, it seemed. Suddenly, I was writing pieces for every school contest, submitting poems for every poetry club event, and gaining a small amount of celebrity amongst the students that flowed in these circles. My teachers had always praised my work, but as my peers began to notice my talent, I started to see this as more than a hobby. I began to believe that I might be able to make it outside the community of my high school. When the spring poetry contest was announced, a contest held for students nationwide, I threw myself into it, heart and soul. I stayed up for 3 days crafting the perfect poem, the greatest work of my life, and when I hit send on it, I slumped back into my chair and let the euphoria wash over me. It was Saturday night. I was exhausted after the effort of birthing my perfect work into the world, and all I wanted to do was sleep. I crawled into bed and fell into a deep and untroubled sleep for the next 12 hours. I learned more about her world in those 12 hours than I wanted to. I walked through the doors of my high school and saw the ethereal backdrop for my dream again. It was almost comfortable here. The quiet serenity of the place was a change from the steady flow of ideas and couplets that had been running through my head lately. But I was almost immediately aware of something missing. I looked behind me, expecting to see her dodge away or hide from me, but she wasn't there. This was the only time I could remember being truly alone in this place, and it was a little strange. To feel so alien in a place that you occupy every day is a strange feeling indeed, but I felt my steps taking me into the school once more, so I let myself be led wherever the dream was taking me. As I walked, I was aware of a noise. The fact that there was a noise at all was strange, but the type of noise was stranger still. It was a vibration, a rhythmic thumping from under my feet, and it disturbed the unusual stillness of this place. Thump, thump, thump. Then silence. A few minutes or hours or days later, there would be another thump, 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 followed by a return to the same silence. As I explored the high school, I found myself drawn to the boiler room over by my civics class, and the more I thought about it, the more I realized that the thumping was probably coming from there. The boiler room was a large subterranean basement used by the custodians to store excess chemicals and broken machinery they were hoping to fix someday. It was also where students of a less scholarly caste went to make out or smoke between classes, since it lacked a fire alarm. When I got close to the boiler room, I heard the thumping more clearly and realized I'd been right. There was definitely something in the boiler room, something big, and I doubted it was a group of teenagers necking a little too enthusiastically. When I wrapped my hands around the door handles, though, I was immediately pushed backwards into the lockers against the far wall as something came barreling up through the doors. She turned to glare at me, teeth bared in feral challenge, but when she saw who I was, she stopped growling and started scrambling down the hall towards the English classroom. I sat against the lockers, my backside aching where it had connected with the lockers, and listened to something big and angry make its way up the stairs. I didn't want to know what was making that noise, but I was powerless to do anything but sit there against the lockers. I'm not one to freeze up in dreams. A familiarity with lucid dreaming had probably led me to become way too comfortable in these dreams. But as whatever it was lumbered angrily up from the depths, I realized a fear I hadn't known since childhood. The slap on my shoulder brought me out of these fears as the blonde girl thrust her hand at me and spoke the first words of our strange relationship. "If you don't want to die, then you'd better start running." She offered me a hand, and a moment later we were flying down the polished halls. As we rounded the corner, I heard something burst through the doors, and it sounded like an angry piece of construction equipment as it followed us. My guide took us down hallway after hallway, taking corners at random, before finally wrenching open the door to a custodial closet and pushing both of us inside. She cracked the door, peeking out into the hallway, and all I could do was lean against the wall and pant. I was tired. I didn't ever recall being tired in a dream before. And as I sat, I realized my butt still hurt where I'd hit it on the locker. I wanted to ask things, what was chasing us, and why for starters. But as the thumping footsteps got closer to our hidden cubby, I was filled once more with that sense of dread. I moved up beside her, peeking out into the hallway, as a creature like nothing I'd ever seen before dragged itself into view. It was shadow, it was darkness, and as its form slithered past us, it looked to be amorphous as well as boundless. She closed the door quietly before it came even with it, and sat back in the closet as the creature moved off into a different part of the school. We sat in silence for nearly 10 minutes before I dared to speak. What the hell was that? She looked at me quizzically, and I feared she was incapable of hearing me. I would later come to realize how long it had been since she'd had anyone to talk to. She closed her eyes as I repeated my question and seemed to savor the sound they made. She relished them, burned them into her memory, rolled around in them like a dog with a smell it likes, and when she'd finally absorbed them as much as possible, she answered me. I don't know. I've been calling it shade for however long it is that I've been here. Her voice was thick from disuse, but it was cultured with just a hint of an accent that I couldn't place. She told me her name was Lisa. She told me she believed she was 16, but couldn't be sure. She told me she had been here for as long as she could remember. She told me that she could move between dreams. Between dreams? What do you mean? Instead of telling, she showed me. Her hand looked like a starfish when she set it against the back wall of the janitor's closet. The pinkness of her skin stood out against the dingy wall and made it all the more apparent when the paint began to crumble and the wall began to melt away. Suddenly, there was sunlight in the closet, thick and buttery against the dingy darkness, and we were looking at a field of flowers that stretched on into infinity. I put my hand against the image, expecting resistance, but instead fell into a landscape of fragrant technicolor flowers. Lisa came in behind me, and as she did, the portal back to the high school closed. Where are we? She shrugged. Some other dream? She has it pretty often. As long as we stay out of the area where she is, then she'll never know that we were here. I had a million questions to ask her, too many to organize right away, but just as I'd found my voice again, someone was shaking me and my mom was asking if I was hungry and might like some dinner. It was 2 weeks. 2 weeks of hoping and praying before the dream returned. I sit at the edge of the precipice, looking at the world from afar. I'm a prisoner of my reality. My passage to her world has been barred. I spent those 2 weeks in a haze. I received word that my poem had gone to nationals, and I think that my distracted nature was seen as dazed relief. They thought I was happy, that I was living in the clouds, but in my mind, I just wanted to go back to the dream. She needed me, and I needed to know more about her. I spent those 2 weeks analyzing what I now knew about the dream. The first was that whatever happened in the dream happened in real life. I had woken up the next morning with a large bruise on my backside and a similar bruise on my shoulder. Either I had hurt myself outside the dream and it had translated into the dream itself, something I doubted, or I could be hurt inside the dream. The second thing was far more urgent. I needed to find out how to instigate the dream. I tried recreating the events that had led to the dream, dragging myself to the edge of collapse or overworking my mind without rest until I dropped. But it was no use. 2 weeks later, and I hadn't had so much as a dream that I could remember in the little amount of sleep that I'd gotten. As I went to sleep that night, I focused all my mental faculties on the dream itself, how it had felt and the landscape I'd been in, and as I focused, I could feel my mind slipping off to sleep. I awoke in the high school again. I ran through the halls, heedless of what else might find me, and it wasn't long before she had tracked me down again. She dropped into the hallway before me, seemingly from nowhere, and when she saw me, her face split into a wide grin. She ran to me, wrapping me in her arms. She smelled ethereal as I wrapped my arms around her as well, of old dust, of sour memories, of the universe itself. "I didn't think I'd ever see you again," she said, and in her voice I heard relief. Her world lies alongside my own, my dreams the key to her realm. But how did she come to reside here? Her own dreams have been overwhelmed. She took me back to the field of flowers. There, she answered my questions. I asked her a million questions as we sat together in the field. We had found a tree that sprang from the flowers in clear confusion, and we sat there as she told me her story. Until that moment, I had believed she was older than I, maybe by as much as 5 years, but as she spoke, her girlhood came back to her. She drew her knees in close, her blonde hair creating a curtain through which she peeked at me, and she seemed embarrassed by the story. No, not embarrassed, I now realize. She was afraid that telling it to me would make it true. She'd had her own dream once. She couldn't remember what had happened before it, but she could remember there being a before. She had dreamed inside a castle and played princess with knights and wizards at her command, and dragons and goblins to slay. Sometimes she had stood on the battlements and looked pretty as the knights fought for her favor. Sometimes she had put on armor and killed the dragons herself, leading her knights on grand adventures. Whatever she was doing, she was happy, and the dream had returned almost every night. It returned because I wanted it to. It came back because I thought about it before bed, and so my mind opened the portal to this place. These dreams aren't normal dreams. You can get hurt in them, and you can even die in them. When you dream here, your mind takes you to a place in the spirit world. I don't know how, so don't ask, but I know that it is so. She had dreamed this dream for quite some time, years, she said, when one day something different happened. Her knights had encountered something on the edges of her kingdom that had killed some of them. None of my knights had ever died in my dream. They would get hurt sometimes, but a wizard would always heal them. When they didn't come back, and the wizard couldn't make them come back, I knew this was different. I knew this was something else. For 2 nights, it had destroyed her dream world. When it came to the castle, I was too afraid to fight it. It was dark and scary, and it looked wrong. I hid it inside the castle, unable to face it, and as it broke down my walls, I closed my eyes and tried to wake up. I tried and tried, but it wouldn't happen. And when it finally got me, I woke up somewhere else. That was when she discovered that she could make portals between dreams. She'd thrown her splayed hand against the castle wall as the bulbous thing had loomed over her, and suddenly a circle had appeared on the wall. It showed a desert in the throes of a sandstorm, and she'd jumped in without a second thought. She'd woken up in someone else's dream. She floats like a dandelion dreamer, adrift on the seas of a dream, never to return to her own mind, her world never to be as it seems. I visited with her often over the next few years. The dreams came almost every night, and as we explored, we grew closer. She told me that no matter how much she tried, she couldn't wake up. She could sleep, still needed to sleep, But as for eating or drinking, she found that she didn't need these things anymore. The bulbous creature followed her no matter where she went, but she was able to avoid it, and over time, she just became used to living inside other people's dreams. She didn't know how long she'd done it, and she didn't care. I was not the first person to try to talk to her, but I was the only one who believed she was more than a figment of their imagination. This dream girl has stolen my senses. Her beauty has taken my mind. I know that life is ephemeral, but I know that her heart must be mine. I didn't acknowledge right away that I was falling for her, but I think I knew deep down. My poems became all about her, this ephemeral goddess that walked my dreams, and my fans responded. I had members of the art club asking to paint her from my description. I had droves of female fans asking me to tell who she was. They believed she was someone at the school that I was sharing my nights with. I had people who had read my work asking about her, my moonlight girlfriend, but I gave out very little information. For her part, I could tell she appreciated my company, but she seemed afraid to get close to me. As months became years, she showed me sights that defied description. She took me to dreamscapes so beautiful that I could hardly grasp them, and to places so wondrous I can hardly describe them, but all the while, she refused to tell me what she was looking for. Her hand would creep into mine on occasion, though, and I remembered being filled with warmth each time she touched me. Inevitably, our night excursions would be cut short by the appearance of the shadow creature. He would blunder upon us, his screamy sucking sound glopping before him, and we would flee until he moved away. She never fought him, said it would be useless to try, but I somehow knew that as long as it existed, she would never really be safe. As time passed, I noticed her become more melancholy, and one night I asked what was troubling her. She took my hand, interlocking our fingers, and looked at me across what seemed like 1,000 miles. I don't want this to be my life anymore. I want to hold your hand, feel its texture, and know that when the dawn comes, I won't be left alone. I want to leave this place. I'm sick of looking over my shoulder for the shadow creature. I want a life. She sounded so sad, so adrift, but I had no idea how to help her. She longs to leave here forever, this kingdom ethereum so deep. She wishes to walk in the moonlight, to walk her own dreams as she sleeps. I was in my senior year when she left me forever. I came into the dream high school that I'd come to know so well and found her sitting in an empty classroom. She was seated in one of the desks, and at first I thought she was asleep. When she turned to look at me, though, I could see that she was deep in contemplation. She looked up at me with real hope, and I realized that something had happened while I was gone. I think I need to destroy the shadow creature. She detailed her plan, how if she killed it, she might be allowed to go back to her dream and wake up. But all I could hear was the first lines of her suicide note. I tried to reason with her, talk her out of this needless waste of her life, but she wouldn't hear of it. I had clearly underestimated her resolve, and every argument against it only seemed to infuriate her more. I thought you were different. I thought you understood how important this was to me. Well, to hell with you then. I'm going with or without you. She walked out and I let her go, unable to say any more. When I woke up, I fought sleep for the next 4 days. I was out of high school by then, starting my second year of college, and my poems had appeared in magazines and compilations since my senior year. I had woken up in my familiar bedroom and immediately went to find a cup of coffee. For the next 4 days, I drank coffee. I took caffeine pills. My face stung from slapping it, and I fought the urge to sleep. I didn't want to go back to that place and see what had happened to her. The thought that she was dead scared me, but the thought of what she'd become if she killed Shade scared me even more. Eventually, I lost the battle and was forced to submit to sleep. When I returned to the halls, it was like the first time. I felt no one, and the silence was oppressive. In ethereal halls I wander. The only sounds are my own. I listen for her, but hear nothing. I find myself all alone. I searched for her for hours. I combed the school, every classroom and mop closet, from the library to the gym, but she was nowhere to be found. I quickly found myself running through the halls, calling her name, as I threw caution to the wind and wanted nothing but the solace of her voice and her presence. I wanted to see her, to know she was okay, and to apologize for my cowardice. A cowardice I was still indulging even then. I would not let myself think about the cellar. She's walking through the halls of my high school. Her hair is a halo of gold. She runs through my dreams as I slumber, my sanity threatening to fold. I feared the cellar, feared the creature that dwells there. I'm past that now. I'm going to find her. Tonight, I'm going to go into the basement and settle this once and for all. My parents will likely find this, as well as my last poem. And if they do, I hope they send it to my editor so she can publish what will likely be my last work. I'm going in there. I'm going to bring Lisa out, or I'm going to die trying. I will have my dream girl. Hello, friends. I hope you enjoyed tonight's stories as much as I did. If so, please take a moment to like this video and let me know in the comments which story was your favorite. If you enjoy my narrations and the stories I share, be sure to subscribe so that you don't miss any upcoming videos. I've got my eye on that community tab, which means I need to get to 500 subscribers. Thank you all for watching and listening. Have a great night, everyone.